Well, hello again, and welcome to our study of the book of Job. As you just saw on our screen, we're still in Job, and we're looking at lesson 10 right now. We're jumping a little ahead from where we were in the previous lesson, several chapters. We'll talk about that in a moment. The title of the lesson is The Wisdom of Youth. And as you can see on the screen, we're going to be going through a number of passages. Because of that, we're not going to go through a lot of detail in what each passage says. But what I want to do is go ahead and give you a little bit of an introduction, talk you through a little bit of it. And then there are a couple of places, particularly at the end, where I think the best thing to do is just let the text speak. And I will read that to you and maybe make a reflective comment along the way. If you have your Bible, then you want to open it up to Job chapter 32. You've seen already a number of passages that we're going to be looking at from chapter 32, from chapter 33, a couple of passages. A selection from chapter 35, although I'll read a little bit more from chapter 35 than is listed. And then the conclusion, we'll look at chapter 37. What are we looking at? We're going to be looking at a cycle from someone other than who Job has been interacting with up until this point. We'll mention him in a moment, and we'll have a lot to say about him. Before we get started, though, do you ever forget to say something you said you were going to say and then remember only after the fact? I did that last lesson when I had said, talking about Job's friends and the seriousness of what was going on, given that they were his friends, that I was going to say something later at the application, and I failed to do that. I want to do it now because in bringing that up now, it serves not only as a conclusion to what was studied in last lesson, but also serves as an introduction here, given the fact that Job is going to be talking to someone else. And the point that I wanted to make last week was the encounters that Job was having with his friends were particularly acute. They were particularly devastating for him because they were his friends. And the one thing that we know is that it really does take someone being a friend to hurt you. And what I mean by that is, if it's someone that you're not acquainted with, it may just be a coworker, it may be an enemy. But when someone does something to you or says something to you that is hurtful and spiteful, while it is hurtful and spiteful, the reality is, because it doesn't come from someone particularly close, it doesn't have the exact same impact. It really takes a friend, if you will, to enact such a kind of a betrayal. And one example of that is from the life of Jesus. You remember that Jesus had predicted there would be someone who would betray him. And lo and behold, we find out in the Garden of Gethsemane that it was Judas. Judas approaches Jesus with a regiment of people to identify who Jesus is so that Jesus could be arrested. And as Judas approaches Jesus, Jesus looks at him and says, "Friend, are you going to betray me with a kiss?" Notice then, Jesus also understands what it means to be betrayed. It really can't be called betrayal, if you think about it, in that sense, if it weren't for someone being very, very close, a family member, a loved one, or a friend. And so one of the things I wanted to point out last lesson, I want to bring up this lesson, is the fact that with everything that Job has been going through, his friends started off well and being quiet, but then they've spent 20 chapters or more confronting Job about everything. And we got a sense of Job's hurt once we got to the end of last week's lesson, to recognize that Job was just at a loss. And we've seen that over and over again. Jesus knows that. We've known that. But it shows you how important and significant friendship is, that when there is a kind of accusation or a lack of trust, or in this case, almost a sense of betrayal, it hurts all the more. We're going to hear today from someone who is not named until this lesson, is not named until these chapters, and will not be mentioned again afterwards. But as we do that, I think it's important to recognize we are skipping a lot of chapters. We looked at chapter 19 last time, and now we're going to be looking at chapter 32 through 37, which is 6 chapters. Obviously, we're only going to be looking at a couple of passages there. But just to kind of set the tone for where we're going, I said last lesson that once we get to that point, that's the last time we're going to hear from Job until after God speaks. I want to bring up one last thing here in getting ready for that, and that is a quick review of what takes place in the chapters up from chapter 19 through chapter 31. And here's how that's going to go. Remember that it was Bildad that Job was responding to, and then following Job's response to Bildad, we have in chapter 20 in the ending of the second cycle, Zophar approaches and rebukes Job. We have in chapter 21, then Job's response to Zophar. Then it goes all the way back and starts over with Eliphaz. And we have Eliphaz speaking to Job in chapter 22. And then 2 chapters, 23 and 24, Job responding to Eliphaz. And then the last one to speak in that third cycle is Bildad in chapter 25, but he only has 6 verses. And it's a very, very short response or a short word to Job. And then the cycle ends. What you then find is chapters 26 through 31 offer up Job's extended final words. Within that is chapter 28, which is a special focus on wisdom. And then we have in chapter 31 a representative list of the things that Job denies doing. In other words, in saying he didn't do certain things, or if he had done something, then he was worthy of punishment. He lists out a number of things in a flurry of assertions regarding his innocence. If I had done this, then this. If I had done this, then this. And the point is he hasn't. So he's asserting his innocence and integrity over and over again as he gets through chapter 20 or 31. And then in the last verse, verse 40 of chapter 31, the author tells us the words of Job are ended. In one sense, then you could say Job rested his case. He had said everything that he needed to say to his friends. There was no more convincing them. He's exhausted everything he could tell them. Well, that's not the end, however, as we recognize. All the while, Job has been wanting to speak to God, or he's been wanting God to speak back. And what that means is he's been wanting God to vindicate him, to show his friends that he's not done anything wrong. He'd be satisfied with that. I'm sure that he would also want to know why God was allowing this to happen to him. After all, the discussion between Job and his friends is complete. After all of this, you expect Job to hear from God, but we don't hear from God. God still does not speak. Instead, a new friend is introduced. And I put that in quotation marks. He's not referred to as a friend, but he is someone who has been, at least in some form or fashion, for some duration of time, present, witnessing all that's been going on between Job and his friends. This new character will then speak for 6 chapters uninterrupted. And we'll see his opening words in the lesson that we're about to read. We're going to go through chapter 32, a few verses, and see his opening words. And then we'll conclude with chapter 37, the last few verses there, the final words that this person speaks to Job. In the middle, we'll see a few of the things that this person says about Job and to Job directly as we move forward. As of course you'll recognize as we get ready to read, his name is Elihu. We'll say more about him in a moment. Let me go ahead before we read the text and give you a sense of what the outline is going to be, given the fact that we have a number of chapters and passages to go through. The title of the lesson is the wisdom of youth. Always when you want to edit, you forget something. The wisdom of youth. We're well aware of the wisdom of truth, but the wisdom of youth, and you saw that on the main page. The point here, of course, is Elihu is going to emphasize how young he is. Well, let's go through. I've got a number of passages. We're going to break it up into 3 sections. Chapter 32, verses 1 to 10, we enter Elihu and his first speech. He will come in and he will give his first speech. Then Elihu will rebuke Job. And we'll see in a couple of passages out of chapter 33 how that comes about. And I'm actually going to read 33, verse 1, moving into that. I think that's an important introduction as well. Then we'll have from speech 3 further rebukes of Job, and that's going to be chapter 35 verses 9 to 10. But I really want to go ahead and read beginning earlier than that because there's a lot more setting that up. We won't have a lot of comment on it, but we do want to read it. And then Elihu's parting words, how and who God is. In other words, who God is and how he is, what he's like. Chapter 37 verses 14 to 24. Let's go ahead and look at that. I want to go ahead and read that passage to you. And the thing I want to point out, we alluded already to the fact that there were a number of speeches. I didn't number them all. We're not going to be looking at all of them. But as we'll see in a moment, there are 4 speeches contained in these six chapters. Let me read to you chapter 32, verses 1 to 10. There is narration and then there is poetry. We'll see that taking place. Here's what the New American Standard says, the 1995 update. Then these 3 men ceased answering Job. because he was righteous in his own eyes. But the anger of Elihu, son of Barashel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned. Anger against Job, his anger burned because he justified himself before God. We'll come back and see more about what that means. And his anger burned against his three friends because they had found no answer, and yet they had condemned Job. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were years older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his anger burned. So you hear that about 4 times in this text. Elihu's anger burns against Job and against Job's friends. Then we receive word again about who he is. So Elihu, the son of Barashel the Buzite, spoke out and said, I am young in years and you are old. Therefore I was shy and afraid to tell you what I think. I thought age should speak and increased years should teach wisdom. But it is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives them understanding. The abundant in years may not be wise, nor may elders understand justice. So I say, listen to me. I too will tell what I think. Well, let's go ahead and look at this. As we said, the first few verses here start off with prose. We haven't seen prose or narration since chapter 2 of the book of Job. Up from chapter 3 through just now, we've been reading poetry, and we'll see poetry pick up again here with verse 6 in a moment. But what we hear is a comment about another figure who has been standing by. Question is, who is Elihu? His name means he is God, or he is my God. Eli is my God, and who is he? He is my God. Now, this may be just a name. It could be reflective also of who he is in terms of his relationship with God, and certainly functionally and literarily, we can see that in some way Elihu is serving as a forerunner or a precursor to God's speeches coming up beginning in chapter 38. But be that as it may, there's more going on in this text even than that. At times it can be necessary to look at the meaning of a name if there's anything literarily going on with that. He is my God. Son of Barashel. Barashel or Barakel, some of your translations may put a K in there, means bless, O God, or God has blessed. That's not the most important thing. It's a wonderful name, but now we're seeing 2 names that are built on the word for God in Hebrew, El. So there's certainly one who has relationship with God. Further, he is named the Buzite. Now, we see then 3 generations if Buzite is a person. We'll talk about that in a second. But we see really Elihu is described in more detail than Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They're simply named by where they're from. Here we see a father's name, possibly a grandfather's name, and then a little bit that tells us something about who he is. He is the son of Barashel the Buzite. Now, Buzi, or Buz, B-U-Z, in Genesis 22, verses 20 and 21, is known as the son of Abraham's brother Nahor. There was Uz, then there was Buz, all right? There was another son that was born as well, but this is the one that is mentioned here. It's possible, if this is going to be a reference to historical people, that we have here someone who is from the same time as, well, obviously the same time as Job, but the fact that this would put Job in the same time as the descendants of Abraham and his family. So we're seeing someone not only related in terms of time, but also there could be a sense of relationship and explain how he has a relationship with God as well. It's possible that Buz was also a location. In Jeremiah 25:23, this is a place name that is basically in the region of Edom, which would place this in the same region where Job was from. And so, and it could be that that place was named after the person who is in that ancestry of Job, or excuse me, of Abraham's family. So we have that. And then lastly, he's referred to as of the family of Ram. And what's interesting about this is that in the Jewish Targums, which are Jewish and Aramaic interpretations of the text, some have suggested that's Abram, Ram, which would again put him in that same family. It helps in terms of chronology, perhaps, but it also helps in terms of associating Job Elihu, excuse me, with a reference to his worship of God. And certainly as he speaks over the next several chapters, he is going to speak as one who has a very keen sense of the character of God, who God is, what he's like, how he responds to people. And there could be a lot of reference to that based on the fact that he is from a family who would have known God. There's justification then for what he's about to say. Well, what do we see is not only who Elihu is, we also see his response. And that's interesting because it's described both in the prose and in his own words. First, we're told that he is angry against Job and that he is angry with Job's friends. The question is, why is he angry with Job? We already heard in chapter 32, verse 1, that Job was seen as righteous in his own eyes. When Elihu is described in his anger against Job, it's because he says Job has made himself, or he has justified himself before God. That's the New American Standard 95 update. In his own commentary, Hartley says that he would translate it this way, that Job made himself more righteous than God. The text literally means justified before God, or it could mean more than God or in front of God. In other words, placing his own righteousness ahead of God. That's the accusation that appears to be what Elihu is bringing against Job. The Christian Standard Bible, the New International Version, and the English Standard Version all read, he had justified himself rather than God. So in place of or in front of could mean ahead of in the sense of rather than. So you have a number of things going on here. We've seen Job trying to justify himself before God in the sense that he's trying to stand before God and seek vindication and demonstrate that he's not guilty of anything deserving of any kind of calamity or distress that he's been experiencing. But what Elihu is saying seems to be otherwise. He is justifying himself before God, or as we read, made himself righteous, more righteous than God, or had justified himself rather than God. What the third translation here says, had justified himself rather than God, is the fact that Job is focused more on himself than recognizing what the character of God is. Each of these in some way, though, suggests that Job was misplaced in his focus on what he was trying to do. That is a little bit different from what his friends were saying. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were basically telling him, you're not even being honest with yourself. How can you say you're going to be honest with God? You just need to confess your sin and let God forgive you, and then you can be restored. Something a little bit different is being said here from the perspective of Elihu. Then he's angry at Job's friends because they found no answer, and they still condemn Job. So with all the times that Job was able to respond in their rebukes, they never could come up with the answer. They kept coming back with the same thing over and over again. It's interesting, Elihu can say this, they found no answer, they still condemn Job. He said, with all that you've come up with, you still haven't come up with the thing that proved Job's guilt or identified the thing that Job was guilty of. What's curious about that is Elihu has been around, even though he's not been mentioned, he's been around long enough to have observed what's going on. Some have suggested that while this is going on, there have been people passing by. There might have been some of these things taking place in public. And we have talked in previous lessons about the fact that Job could list all the people that have abandoned him, whether actually leaving his presence or emotionally. And that would suggest then, of course, people had been around him. Well, he's got anger, but there's a reason why he's not said anything. And what we see in this text is Elihu gives the reason for not answering sooner, why he's hesitated. And that is because he was younger. He says, I am younger, you are older. Basically, he's saying, I'm respecting my elders. Now, some are going to question how much of a person of integrity Elihu is. Is he being sarcastic here? Is he being condemning in his own right? Is he maybe a little bit more sure of himself than he should be? Some have even suggested that what's going on from a literary perspective is that the Elihu figure that appears in these chapters is almost like a sense of comic relief, perhaps because Elihu ends up not saying anything really that different from the friends, although it's a little bit different. And then, of course, there's more about what he says about God in here. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I do think that there's a certain seriousness here, and I do think that there's a genuineness on Elihu's part, But there may be that sense, similar to what you find, for instance, with Joseph when he tells of his dreams. His own brothers say that he's thinking a little bit too much of himself. Is he seeing, while it's true that his dreams will come true, maybe he's playing that up too much? Maybe Elihu is playing a kind of false humility here. We don't know. All we have are his words, and we never will see a response to his words. And we'll see that as we get to the end. His words are, he has been young, they are old, and therefore he's respecting of their eldership or of their age. And we'll see in a second what he says about that. What overcame his sense of youth, however, why is it that he eventually said, you know what, it doesn't matter how young I am, I can't stay quiet any longer. It's the fact that he sat there and they couldn't give an answer. Job couldn't give an answer. On a silly note, maybe you've been in a classroom before or on a job site, and someone's trying to figure something out, and you go around the room and no one knows the answer, and they're not calling on you, but you know the answer, but you're not going to say anything just yet. I've been in that situation. Perhaps you have too. Elihu is respecting not only the fact that they are older, but probably the nature of the relationship that Job has with these friends. But he sits there and he watches over and over again as the friends fail to truly identify what's going on with Job, and they have no answer for him. And so finally he just says, you know what, I have to speak up. What happens then, beginning in verse 6, is a reiteration of who he is, where he's from, and what his relationship to his ancestry is. And then he himself speaks in verses 6 through 10. And there will be a repetition here, so we'll quickly go through that. He again voices his own reasons for delaying. He says that young people or youth should yield to age. So he is demonstrating that in verses 6 and 7. In verses 8 and 9, he says, though, that he has the source of his resolve to speak. And this is going to be something interesting. It's going to come up later. We may not get to that passage, but it's interesting what he says here. It is spirit in a person, breath of the Almighty who gives wisdom. In other words, it's not about age. And he'll say that later throughout part of his dialogues, that it's true that it's not about how old a person is. It's something else that's involved. He's basically saying spirit in a person, whether that's God's spirit at that point. He's talking about the fact that they have life, but he also then goes on to say the breath of the Almighty that gives wisdom. It's existence. Life gives wisdom. It's not about how old you are. And so, there is that kind of attitude he might have, but at the same time, he's at least wise enough to check and see that, well, I better not say anything for a while. And he waits and waits and waits, and eventually he speaks. And then verse 10 is the beginning of his dialogues. So he says then in verse 10, listen to me. I too will tell you what I think. What we see then here is the opening of a series of dialogues that will extend from chapter 32 through chapter 37. He will speak uninterrupted, as we've already mentioned, and he will go through what we'll say are 4 cycles of speeches, or 4 speeches. We'll identify those in a moment. But it's curious to know that first, it's 6 chapters long. He will have 4 speeches back to back to back without Job saying anything in response. And in fact, Job will never respond to Elihu. What we find then is within these 4 speeches, within these 6 chapters, it's more than any one of the other friends had opportunity to say. So with 4 speeches, the others didn't have 4 speeches. Poor Zophar only had 2. The others had 3 each. And if you want, you can go back and quantify how much each of their speeches added up to compare with Elihu. The point is, though, after their cycle is over, Elihu speaks without interruption in 4 speeches. What are the 4 speeches? Speech 1 begins with chapter 32, verse 6, goes all the way through chapter 33, the end of that, which is verse 33. And what we see in chapter 32, verse 6 is this word. So Elihu spoke out and said. And what we're going to find in the beginning or the rest of chapter 32 on through chapter 33, and we'll look at 33 in a moment, is the rebuke of Job's friends and of Job. And we'll see him go first to the friends, then to Job, but there's a little bit of an interweaving of all of them in his rebuke in part of that chapter. Then speech 2 is in chapter 34, where it again begins with verse 1 and says, then Elihu continued and said. And what we're going to find in chapter 34 is an extensive defense of God's just actions. God acts justly. He is righteous. He's a person of an integrity, a being of integrity. Now, our lesson, we're not looking at chapter 34, but one of the things I will say, and I'll just say it now before I forget. I don't want to get caught up into forgetting to say something again later when I said I want to say it. So let me say it now. One of the things we're going to find is that you want to read all of this. We're only good looking at a little bit here and there to get a sense of Elihu, but it's a very intriguing set of dialogues or speeches that Elihu gives. And it's interesting to note what he has to say about God. But I think it would be best for you to go back and read all 6 chapters of chapters 32 to 37 all together and see how the text flows. And as you see that, some of you will have good study Bibles, or at least good Bibles that have chapter headings or section headings. You can see a summary of what's taking place from section to section. Here in chapter 34, it's about a focus on God and who he is and his character. There'll be more of that to come in the latter chapters as well. Speech 3 is chapter 35, and it again begins in verse 1 of 35 with, "Then Elihu continued and said." And what we're going to find in chapter 34 are more rebukes of Job, words to Job that God does not listen to empty pleas, and we'll have to touch on that a little bit, and that God is waiting until he is ready to speak. God just doesn't answer, but he will answer in due course. And what we'll see is that after Elihu speaks, God will speak. Then the final speech takes up 2 chapters. Speech 4 is 36 and 37. Again, in verse 1 of chapter 36, it says, "Then Elihu continued and said again." And what we're going to see here is another word about God in the sense of his character, the greatness of his work, and the greatness of his character. It's not completely parallel to what you find in chapter 34. What we find in chapter 34 is God's just actions, that he acts righteously, but there is more about his character and work, particularly with the strength of his saying. As we'll see when we get to that part, there is in the description of God that really lends itself to the title of our unit, and we'll see that as we move forward. Well, one of the questions we have, so we have those 4 speeches, and that all begins with what we've just read. The question we have to ask ourselves about Elihu is he serving as a mediator between God and Job? The reason I ask that is, remember, in a previous lesson, earlier chapters, Job has cried out saying, "I wish that I had an intercessor, a mediator, to go and plead my case to God." The problem is that God would be the one who could mediate, but he's the one that Job wants to mediate toward God. Is it then a reversal of sorts that God may have a mediator to prepare Job for his own speeches? So he sends, or in some way, Elihu represents that focus or that function. Job had asked for one as a mediator and intercessor, and there wasn't one. Elihu speaks last before God does, as we'll see, because once Elihu speaks, God will speak. Job doesn't. And what we're going to find is there are a number of things that Elihu says in his speeches that when you read God's own speeches, there are some similarities there. What Hartley, who I mentioned earlier in his translation of part of chapter 32, says is this: with regard to Elihu, his name and his function in the book indicate that he is Yahweh's forerunner. True to his name, Elihu will defend God's honor, teaching that God mercifully and justly disciplines his servants, and his teaching prepares for Yahweh's appearance to Job. It's quite possible then that there is kind of a buffer, if you will. Note then also, when you read the speeches in their entirety, you will catch references to the various discussions and topics and terms that were raised throughout the document up to this point. We'll see a hint of that as we go through a couple of these. But one of the things I want you to see is that what Elihu is going to do in his speeches is a lot of the things that Job has said about himself, he'll say back to Job. Some of the things that are being used in response to Job's friends, they have been said before. A lot of what's going to be said, of course, is directed at Job. And so we're going to see a lot of repetition of what Job has said back to him. But be aware of that. We've seen some of that repetition before. Here, it's a different person speaking it. What we're going to find then, as we've gotten done talking about chapter 32, verses 1 to 10, the rest of the chapter is directed at the 3 friends and their failure to assess Job's situation. Because they didn't assess it correctly, he has to speak up. And unlike many who would seek in an argument to help see how both sides could have some good points, Elihu will tell both friends and Job that they are wrong. And so even as he's acting perhaps as a forerunner to God, as a mediator from God to Job, as he has assessed the situation between Job and his friends, he didn't say, you got some good points and you've got some good points. He's just sat back and said, basically, you're talking past each other. Neither of you are making good points. And so now he has to step in as a kind of a third party objective observer and say, now it's time for me to speak. Many times we see someone get in between to try and help negotiate and say, well, you've got good points here, but this is wrong. You've got good points here, but this is wrong. And he's saying neither of you is saying the right thing. Neither of them has assessed what the situation is all about. Well, we've gotten through that first part of Elihu in introduction. What I want to do now is talk us through a little bit of chapter 33. There are two sections that we're tasked to look at, verses 2 to 4. I want to start with verse 1, and then also verses 22 to 30. So let me start by looking at chapter 33, 1 to 4. And what I want you to do is listen to the words of Elihu to Job. First, you're going to find that it's in similar fashion with his friends as he pleads for Job to listen. In other words, just as he has pled with his friends for Elihu for them to listen to Elihu, Elihu is going to call on Job to listen to him. And then what we're going to find are words that offer up a word of rebuke to Job, even as he has offered up a word of rebuke against the friends. So we have Elihu's opening words to Job beginning in chapter 33, verses 1 through 4. As he's gotten done talking about the friends, now he turns his attention to Job and he says this, however, now Job, please hear my speech and listen to all my words. Behold, now I open my mouth. And my tongue in my mouth speaks. Very graphic, very literal there. My words are from the uprightness of my heart, and my lips speak knowledge sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Now, one of the things I want you to see here is not only being very vocal and being very literalistic and talking about my mouth opening and my tongue in my mouth speaking. Notice he references his own uprightness, that he speaks with knowledge sincerely. So he's coming to Job on his own level, saying, well, you think you're righteous. Well, I have my own righteousness. And then the other thing he does is he picks up on what he says in a generic sense about man being able to have wisdom by virtue of his spirit and the Almighty. Now he declares personally, he says that I have the Spirit of God in me. He's made me, and the breath of God or the Almighty gives me life. And it's interesting to see the word Almighty used in those couple of places, because those are words that are also similar found in the Abraham's narratives. Well, not only do you have a similarity in the call to listen with an appeal based on his own uprightness of his words, he also is focusing on the source of those words. He declares that the words that he is going to say come from God. Notice again, then, he's appealing not because he's older, but because by virtue of the Spirit and the breath of the Almighty, he can speak. So he has picked up in a general sense from earlier to now a specific sense. What we then find, again, the call to listen, the appeal to listen based on who he is in his own self-uprightness and who he is as a, quote, source coming from God. His words come from God. We then see, before we get to verses 22 and 30, a few things that follow that help prepare us for what he's about to say. What Job is going to, or what Elihu is going to do in the intervening verses, is he's going to challenge Job to refute him. He says, I'm going to say some things, Job. What do you have to say back? Then what you're going to find as you read that chapter very carefully is he's going to repeat Job's claims of innocence and God's unfounded attack against him back to him. And so we don't have time to read all that, but as you go through that, there are going to be things that Job had said earlier about being innocent, about not doing the wrong, and about calling out to God and God not hearing him, God not bringing about his vindication. And so what Elihu is doing here is he's setting Job up. As you've said these things, what's to follow from that? Then he goes on and asks why he will complain that God does not hear. He says, God is God. Who are you to complain that God is not hearing you? Then he indicates that God does speak. And when he does, there are times when he speaks in dreams and he'll speak through speech. They'll be able to hear it. But the problem has been that when God speaks, he's not heard. Then he goes on to describe the fact that God will warn and chasten at times with pain so as to keep one from death. In other words, pain in the suffering is a warning. What would be the warning? The warning is don't fall into sin. In this case, what Elihu is talking to with regard to Job, as Job has refused to admit anything, he's saying sometimes God is going to bring some kind of pain to keep you from death, knowing though that there would be a sense in bringing you back to life, again, as we've talked about before, in the sense of either preventing him from dying altogether or being brought back to this life, not necessarily resurrection. But what Elihu is going to do is recount some of the things that Job himself had suffered and say sometimes God just allows that to happen. And Job is not coming up with the right reasons. He's even limited in why he thinks God would allow this to happen. Elihu is giving us a sense in which God is beyond that even more, that there are some reasons beyond punishment that God is going to allow something to happen. Then with all of that in mind, we get to chapter 33, verses 22 to 30. And this is one of those places where I want to read mainly and just comment very little. But I want you to hear what Elihu has to say. He's just talked about going down to Sheol. And now he says this, verse 22, then his soul draws near to the pit and his life to those who bring death. If there is an angel as mediator for him, 1 out of 1,000, to remind a man what is right for him, then let him be gracious to him and say, deliver him from going down to the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresher than youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then he will pray to God and he will accept him, that he may see his face with joy and he may restore his righteousness to man. He will sing to men and say, I have sinned and perverted what is right, and it is not proper for me. He has redeemed my soul from going to the pit, and my life shall see the light. Behold, God does all these oftentimes with men to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. Very quickly, one of the things we see here is Elihu describes one who is on the brink of death, calling out to God and then being restored to righteousness. Similar things that his friends, Job's friends, have said to him, and something along the lines of what Job had requested, that God would act so that he would not go down. But he was confident that God could prevent it, or even if it did happen, he could bring him back. But one of the things that Elihu is bringing to the forefront here is the fact that that God is being gracious, that there is a possibility of a redeemer, but the goal then is that the person would be able to recognize some sense of his sinfulness. He would say, again, as repeating from verse 27, I have sinned and perverted what is right and is not proper for me. Then the result is that he has redeemed my soul from going to the pit. So there's a prevention there. What ends up happening then is this sometimes happens. God uses allowing these things to happen so as to prevent someone from going further away from God. How accurate that is with regard to what's going on with Job, we can see a connection there. One of the things we said is that God was confident that Job would not sin and reject God because of the calamity. But certainly there is a sense in which Job could be more cognizant of his own faithfulness. Right now, what he's been doing is asking God to show his faithfulness to him. He's not demonstrated his own faithfulness in his own words to God. He's only said that he's not sinned. Well, what ends up happening then is, as that acknowledgement occurs, there is a bringing back from the pit, so to speak, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. In other words, he'd be restored. Now, in saying all of these things, then Elihu says suffering can come as a means to call back to righteousness and averting death due to God's rescuing them. Some of what Elihu says directly reflects and repeats back to Job what Job said to or about God in the same conditions that Job had described his own plight. In other words, the things that Elihu has said could come upon a person for the purpose of God's redemption, Job is basically had already said those things himself. Well, we skip chapter 34, where what Elihu basically does is saying God is justified in all he does. He doesn't do anything wrong. When wickedness is punished, I'll say it this way, when God punishes the wicked, it's just. And therefore, there's a lot more in that chapter, but God is never going to act unjustly in any way. What we're going to find are further rebukes of Job by Elihu in chapter 35. Our lesson says read verses 9 to 10, but I think it's going to be important to go ahead and begin all the way at verse 1 and read through, and then we'll make a quick comment. It's rather interesting to see how Elihu is working through this process of his making his own case and argument toward Job. Verse 30, or chapter 35, verse 1, and we'll read through verse 10. Then Elihu continued and said, do you think this is according to justice? Did you say my righteousness is more than God's? For you say, what advantage will it be to you? What profit will I have more than if I had sinned? I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds, they are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are many, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? And what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness is for a man like yourself, and your righteousness is for a son of man. And then verses 9 and 10, because of the multitude of oppressions, they cry out. They cry for help because of the arm of the mighty. But no one says, where is God my maker, who gives songs in the night? And then verse 11, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds of the heaven. And we'll stop there. There's much more. That chapter goes on. But notice one of the things that Elihu is doing here is he's establishing that Job doesn't really have an argument, that even if he does, as Job himself has said, even if I go before God in my own righteousness, I know that my righteousness will still bear out some kind of imperfection, some kind of sin. What Elihu is doing here in these verses, particularly verses 9 and 10, as we've just read, is he's highlighting an attitude similar to Job in not seeking God for God. In other words, he's not seeking God for God's sake. He's seeking God for his own. What Elihu is going to then do is he's going to go on to say that it is pride that hinders hearing from God. Notice what he says in verses 9 and 10 again. Because of the multitude of oppressions, they cry out. They cry for help because of the arm of the Almighty. Clearly, in their despair, they call out. But notice here, he says in verse 10, no one says, where is God my maker, who gives songs in the night? And then, of course, you see there after that are a series of questions. Basically, they're only calling out to God because they are in trouble. They're not seeking God as maker and the one who actually can provide hope and joy. This may not be totally consistent with what Job is doing, but Elihu can see some of that. Job has not been seeking God for God. He has been seeking God because of his oppression. He knows to call out to God because God is mighty and can do it. But is he seeking God for who God is? Well, then we have chapters 36 and 37, which is the fourth cycle of Elihu, or his fourth speech. And what we're going to see as we get to the end are his concluding words. But I think, though I'm not going to read it to you, I want you to go back and read chapter 37, beginning in verse 1. And what you're going to see there, it's hinted at in the verses that we're going to read. But what you're going to see there in those verses, the early verses of chapter 37, are words that describe who God is in terms of thunder and lightning and storm. And in that sense, I would think that we would have a good fit for where the title of our unit has come from, even though the unit itself is talking about storms of life, meaning our calamities and difficulties. But what we're going to see not only here, but in a future lesson, is the idea of God speaking as and in a storm. So I want you to go back and read those first few verses of chapter 37. What we are going to look at in the conclusion here is what are Elihu's final words. And as I've read before, I want you to read carefully as I read out loud. What I want you also to do is I'm going to slow down. And as I read this, I want you to ponder all that Elihu is saying in these final words to Job. And then I want to bring to conclusion what we've been talking about. I want very little content of my own commentary here. I think it's important to listen to Elihu at this point. And then I want to challenge you, I think very strongly, to go back and read all of chapter 32 through 37. These are Elihu's closing words to Job. They end with the first couple of phrases similar to the way they started. Verses 14 to 24 bring us to the conclusion. These are Elihu's parting words on who God is and how he acts. Listen to this, O Job. Stand and consider the wonders of God. Do you know how God establishes them and makes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know about the layers of the thick clouds, the wonders of one perfect in knowledge? You whose garments are hot when the land is still because of the south wind. Can you with him spread out the skies, strong as a molten mirror? Teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot arrange our case because of darkness. Shall it be told him that I would speak? Or should a man say that he would be swallowed up? Now men do not see the light which is bright in the skies, but the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is exalted in power, and he will not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness. Therefore, men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise of heart. Now, we are going to be looking at some of God's own words in the next couple of lessons. But right now, we are already seeing a foretaste of the things that Elihu is asking Job will be asked of Job by God himself. The conclusion here, of course, is that God does not do violence to justice and abundant righteousness. God acts justly always. That's a word that Job is hearing. The last thing he hears then is, therefore men fear him. There's a reason men fear God in the positive way as well as in the sense of making sure that they live rightly. The thing that Elihu ends with, he does not regard any who are wise of heart. In other words, God is ultimately and infinitely wiser, and then the wiseness of humanity does not match up. He doesn't consider that. These are words that Elihu speaks to Job. And it'd be interesting to see what Job's thinking at the time. We don't get any word of that because the next section, chapters 38 into chapter 40 and into 41, will actually be God speaking. Elihu is never mentioned again. He came in out of nowhere, seemingly. Obviously, context would indicate he's been there. He comes in, and when he's done, we're not told that he left. It's just that he stopped speaking. Elihu is never mentioned again. And when God does speak to Job, and then also to Eliphaz as representative of all three friends, Elihu is not mentioned. He's not mentioned as saying that he spoke, that God doesn't say about Elihu that he has spoken on his behalf. He's never talked to, God never addresses him. He's never brought up again. He just disappears. As you read all of Elihu's words, there's no doubt he speaks truth, his youth notwithstanding. We also note, as we've already mentioned, that Job does not respond to Elihu as he did with Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. But one thing Elihu's words appear to do, Job might not have realized it at the time, but he would hear from God next. And looking back on these speeches, we will learn that what Elihu has said in some way prepared Job to hear from God when he was ready to speak to Job. In other words, Job does not respond. But when God does speak, it's almost as if Elihu's words to Job have prepared Job to hear from God. And that may explain the way Job will respond to God later. The way that Job hears Elihu speak now may have prepared Job in such a way that when God does speak, having heard Elihu already may account for Job's response to God's speeches. What we need to know is that God will speak next. So hold on. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. We do thank you for the mystery of your word. Elihu is a mysterious person, and we don't know much about him other than his family lineage, but we don't hear from him again. And then there are always questions as to what his role in this narrative is. We know he rebukes Job's friends, and he rebukes Job. He speaks for you, and he defends you in some way, honors you. I just pray, Father, that you will help us to think about people in our own lives that may represent you when we need to hear from you but are not hearing from you, that you want to use someone to speak on your behalf to us. Lord, I do pray that you would help us to be sensitive to those that you bring in our lives so that we may hear you speak through them. We know that you have a right to speak to us directly. You will. You also have already spoken to us in your word. I just pray you help us to find people that will also help us to understand your word better. Lord, we do pray that as we move forward, we will prepare to hear from you as you speak to Job. And I just ask right now that you'll help us always to be prepared to hear what your Spirit has to teach us through your word. Lord, we love you and praise you, and we just want to worship you and glorify you. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, real quickly, as I mentioned already, we are going to be moving ourselves into a discussion of God's speeches to Job. And so what our first lesson is going to be is Job 38, verses 1 to 7, and then again in 40, verses 1 through 5, hearing God in the storm. And what we're going to find then is that what we have are two lessons coming up that deal with God speaking directly to Job and what then God is going to do. So we have those two lessons, and then the final lesson will deal with what God does with and for Job after he has endured all of these things. I didn't give you much application to think about here, but I think at times it's important to kind of look through the text and let the characters speak, and then ponder, as I did in the prayer, what may God be doing through others to speak to us. We do get to hear multiple voices, and we need to know the discerning voice. We need to be able to discern when it is God speaking through someone and when it is someone who's just speaking on their own. Elihu made the point that he was not speaking on his own behalf, that he sought to speak wisely. He sought to recognize who God is. And so in that regard, we want to take him honestly, even though maybe there's a certain part of him we get pushed back by. Maybe there's a little attitude there we don't know. The fact of the matter is, we always want to be on the lookout for what God may be doing in our lives and the way he might be speaking to us through others. We all want to hear from God. Hopefully, what we do first is prepare our hearts to hear from God. And I think that's what Elihu was doing in the life of Job at this point. What we're going to read then in the next two lessons is what God has to say to Job, just to prepare you in advance, if you don't already know. When God does speak and he answers Job, he won't answer the question that Job's been asking all along. And yet we're going to find that Job is fine with that. The question we'll have to ask ourselves as we asked at the very beginning of our study, will we be able to emulate Job in our understanding of God's answers to us, even as Job was able to receive and respond to God's answer to him? I hope that you have a good week, or however long it is before you watch the next lesson. But as always, I pray that until I do see you again, that you will be well and that you will be blessed.